Dale Pruitt had been the most feared man in Calhoun County for 19 years, and he had earned that fear the hard way, one broken person at a time, one fabricated report at a time, one family quietly destroyed at a time. And for 19 years the fear had protected him, the way a moat protects a castle, keeping accountability at a comfortable distance while he operated in the space between what the law said and what a badge could make people believe. He walked into Darnell Washington's bar on a Friday night in October, the way he always walked into rooms like a man checking on property he owned, and when his eyes moved across the room and found two black women sitting alone at a corner table dressed for a night out, no man beside them, no visible reason to be cautious around them. His brain ran its familiar calculation in under 3 seconds and arrived at its familiar conclusion, which was that these were women who did not know whose town they were in, and that he was the man whose job it was to teach them. What Dale Pruitt did not know, what he could not have imagined, standing in that doorway with a bourbon already in his hand and 11 years of unchallenged cruelty behind him, was that the two women he had just selected as his Friday night entertainment were the same two women who had spent the last 9 months building the federal case that would end him, and that every word he spoke and everything he touched and every order he gave from that moment forward was being captured in a quality of detail that would make a jury of 12 strangers understand exactly who he was before they spent 40 minutes in a room together to decide his future. This is the story of the night Dale Pruitt enforced his last order, and what happened when the women he chose to enforce it against had already been counting everyone before it. Before we go any further, if you believe that accountability matters and that the truth should never stay buried, take a second right now to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell, because the stories we tell here are the ones that need to be heard, and tomorrow's story is one you will not want to miss. The apartment that Simone and Selene Carter shared in the rental district 3 miles from the Calhoun County line was the kind of place that looked temporary from the outside and felt deliberate from the inside, and the distinction mattered because everything about how the Carter twins operated was deliberate, down to the coffee mugs they kept on the left side of the cabinet, and the go-bags they kept packed by the door, and the small encrypted safe bolted to the underside of Simone's desk that held case materials that did not exist anywhere else on any network that could be accessed by the wrong person. It was a Friday evening, 6:30, and the October light was coming through the kitchen window at the low gold angle that only happens in the last hour before dark, and Simone was at the kitchen table with a printed case file open in front of her and a highlighter in her right hand, and a coffee that had gone completely cold an hour ago, and that she had not noticed go cold because she had been reading the same page of the file for the 3rd time. Not because she did not understand it, but because she was looking for something in it that she had not found yet, which was the single thread that when pulled would bring the whole architecture down cleanly. Selene was in the hallway doing her earrings in the small mirror they kept by the door, and she had been watching her sister through the reflection for about 2 minutes before she said anything, because she had learned over 38 years of sharing a face with someone that Simone in deep focus was a thing you either matched or waited out. And tonight, Selene was not in the mood to match it. She told her sister to close the file, not as a request, but as a statement of fact, the way you tell someone the stove is on, because they had not had a single night off in 6 weeks. And tonight was not a night for working. It was a night for them. And Simone looked up from the file with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether an interruption was worth acknowledging. And then she looked at the window and the October light and the cold coffee, and she closed the file. They were different in the ways that mattered, and identical in the ways that counted. And anyone who had known them for more than an hour could tell them apart without looking at the small scar on Simone's left palm, which was the only physical difference between them and which Simone had carried since a 2009 undercover operation in Memphis, where a door had closed faster than she anticipated, and a lock mechanism had done what lock mechanisms do, and which she touched now without thinking about it. As she stood up from the table and stretched the way you touch a thing that has become so familiar, it is less a memory than a habit. Simone was the one who noticed things before they needed to be noticed, the one who walked into a room and knew the exits before she knew the furniture, the one who listened more than she spoke, and whose silences were not emptiness but calculation, and her voice when she used it was the kind that dropped lower under pressure, the way a river gets faster in a narrow channel, which was a quality that had served her well in 12 years at the Bureau, and had also on 3 separate occasions been the thing that kept a situation from becoming something worse than it already was. Celine was the one who moved first, the one whose emotional intelligence was so precise it sometimes felt like a separate sense, the one who could read a room by the way the air in it felt when she walked in, and whose stillness when she chose it was a different kind of stillness than Simone's, less like calculation and more like a compressed spring. And anyone who had ever seen Celine Carter go still in a moment of danger and not understood what that stillness meant had made a mistake. They generally did not make a second time. They were the daughters of Robert Carter, a retired Baltimore detective who had spent 31 years in service and had begun teaching his daughters the law before they could read it, not as an academic exercise but as a survival tool, because he understood that the world his daughters would move through was a world where knowing your rights and being able to state them clearly and without flinching was sometimes the difference between going home and not going home, and who had died 5 years ago on a Tuesday morning from a heart that had simply decided it had done enough, and whose absence was a thing neither of them spoke about directly, but which shaped every day of both their lives in ways that were too large and too quiet to name. Tonight was the anniversary of his death, which was why Celine had told Simone to close the file, and which was why Simone had closed it, and which was why they were going to get dressed and go out and find a bar and have a drink together and be for a few hours not federal agents running the most complex corruption investigation of their careers, but 2 sisters keeping a promise they had made to each other 5 years ago, standing in a hospital corridor, which was that every year on this night they would go somewhere their father would have liked and raise a glass and let themselves feel it. The case file stayed on the table where Simone left it, and the cold coffee stayed beside it, and the apartment was quiet as they got ready, and neither of them said what both of them knew, which was that they were 9 months into a case that was almost ready to move, and that almost was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and that the man at the center of it was still out there moving through the county like he owned it, because for 19 years he essentially had. Darnell Washington's bar had been on the corner of Meridian and 5th for 22 years, and in that time it had hosted birthdays and funerals and first dates and last conversations and every variety of ordinary human occasion that requires a room with a counter and something to drink. And it was the kind of place where the regulars knew which stool was whose, and the lighting was low enough to feel like privacy. Without being so dark, you felt hidden, and where the smell on any given Friday night was a layered thing of fried catfish from the kitchen and old wood and whatever Darnell had been cleaning the counter with, which was always the same brand of lemon cleaner he had been ordering from the same supplier for 15 years. The jukebox was playing Al Green at a volume that suggested conversation rather than demanding it, and the neon Budweiser sign in the window had a flicker in the B that Darnell had been meaning to fix for 2 years, and that had become at this point a feature rather than a flaw, and the bar was perhaps 2/3 full on this Friday, which was a good night but not a packed one, the kind of night where every table had people at it, but nobody was waiting for a seat. Darnell himself was behind the counter doing what he did every Friday night, which was moving with the economical precision of a man who had been doing the same work in the same space for long enough that his body knew where everything was without his eyes needing to confirm it, and he was wiping the section of counter near the register in the particular way he wiped it when something was on his mind, which was twice in the same spot, before moving on to tell his wife had identified 20 years ago and that he had never been able to stop. Under the register, mounted at an angle that was not immediately visible unless you knew to look, was a small monitor showing 4-quadrant feeds from the security cameras Darnell had installed 4 years ago, after an incident that he did not talk about in detail, but that had involved Dale Pruitt and an envelope, and a conversation that had ended with Darnell understanding with a clarity that left no room for interpretation exactly what kind of man he was dealing with, and what kind of protection he was going to need to protect himself from that man going forward. The camera system was running as it always ran when the bar was open, and the recording light on the monitor was a steady green, and Darnell glanced at it the way he glanced at it every 20 minutes or so, not because he expected anything in particular, but because the habit of checking had become the same kind of reflex as locking the door. Something you did because the cost of not doing it was too high to gamble on. Simone and Celine arrived at 8:15, and they arrived the way they arrived everywhere, which was without announcement or display, 2 women in summer dresses who found the corner table near the back wall and sat down with the natural ease of people who choose their seats the same way they choose everything else, with an awareness of the room that did not look like awareness from the outside, but was underneath completely deliberate backs to the wall, clear, sightline to the door, exits noted. They ordered, and Darnell brought the drinks himself because he always brought the first round himself to new faces a habit from the early years when he was still building the bar's reputation 1 customer at a time, and he looked at them in the brief professional way of a man assessing his room. And there was something about the way they sat, something in the quality of their stillness, that registered in the back of his mind without resolving into a specific thought. The way you notice a particular kind of quiet without immediately knowing what kind it is. They touched their glasses together, the 2 of them, quietly, and Simone said something too low for Darnell to hear from the counter, and Celine nodded, and for 20 minutes the night was exactly what it was supposed to be. 2 sisters sitting in a bar on the anniversary of their father's death, honoring the promise they had made, and the jukebox played, and the catfish smell drifted from the kitchen. And outside, the October night was doing what October nights do in Calhoun County, which is carry a particular kind of heaviness in the air that is not quite cold yet, but is reminding you that cold is coming. And then the front door opened, and Dale Pruitt walked in, and the room changed in the particular way rooms change when a man who is feared in them enters them, which is not with visible reaction but with a subtle adjustment of posture and attention, the way birds on a wire all shift slightly when something large moves below them. Dale Pruitt, at 47 years old, was the physical embodiment of a particular kind of American authority figure, which is to say he was large in a way that had been maintained through habits rather than effort, broad across the shoulders and thick through the chest, in a way that had served him well for the first 10 years of his career, and that had since settled into something softer but no less imposing, and he wore civilian clothes on his days off the way. Some men wear their uniforms with the same forward posture and the same territorial claim on whatever space he occupied. The badge was on his belt even off duty, which was not technically required, and was entirely deliberate because the badge was not a piece of equipment to Dale Pruitt. It was a statement, and the statement was the same one he had been making for 19 years, which was that the authority he carried was not something he took off at the end of a shift. It was something he was at all times in all places, regardless of whether he was on the clock or holding a bourbon at a bar on a Friday night. He smelled of Old Spice and stale beer in a combination that the people who knew him best would have recognized from 20 feet away. And before he had even reached the counter, he did the thing that everyone who had spent any significant time around Dale Pruitt had learned to watch for, which was that he cracked his knuckles, left hand first, pressing the fingers back with the right palm until the joints popped in sequence, then the right hand the same way. Not dramatically, not as a performance for the room, but quietly, privately, the way a man might roll his shoulders before lifting something heavy, and the people in the bar who knew what that sound meant shifted almost imperceptibly in their seats. Craig Lennox came in 2 steps behind him, which was where Lennox always was relative to Pruitt, 2 steps behind and slightly to the left. And at 34, he was leaner and sharper featured than his sergeant, but wore the same energy, the same assumption that a room was a thing to be controlled rather than entered. And the difference between them was that Pruitt generated that assumption from inside himself, while Lennox borrowed it from proximity to Pruitt, which is a meaningful distinction because borrowed authority, unlike the real thing, requires constant proximity to its source to function. Darnell appeared at the counter without being called, because Darnell knew better than to make Dale Pruitt wait for service in a room where Pruitt could make waiting feel like an insult, and he poured without asking, because he knew the order from 4 years of the same transaction. And Pruitt took the glass without making eye contact with Darnell and said something about the bar's liquor license renewal coming up next month. The way you mention the weather casually with the complete understanding that the other person in the conversation understands what you mean. And Darnell said that he appreciated the reminder in the flat tone of a man who has been reminded the same way many times, and has learned that the only safe response is acknowledgement. Now, here is the thing about Dale Pruitt that the people who feared him understood, and the people who had only heard about him did not fully appreciate, which was that the cruelty was never random and was never exactly impulsive either. It was selected, and the selection process was something he had developed over 19 years into a near-automatic reflex, a quick assessment of who in a room had the least protection and the most visible dignity, because dignity in people he considered beneath him was the specific quality that activated something in him that he would have called a correction impulse if he had ever examined it, which he never had. He had done this kind of work on Arthur Pendleton, the auto body owner on Route 9, who paid him $600 a month for 11 years to avoid inspections that Pruitt could have manufactured the justification for at any time. And he had done it to 3 families on the east side of the county, whose property values happened to increase dramatically after code violations appeared in their records, and they were forced to sell. And he had done it to a young man named Darius Webb, who had made the mistake of driving a car nicer than most people in the county could afford, and who had spent 4 months in the county jail on a possession charge before his family found a lawyer good enough to get the evidence examined independently. And in each of these cases the process had been the same, which was that Pruitt had identified the target, identified the specific pressure point that would produce compliance, and applied exactly as much force as was necessary to get the result he wanted. Not more, because excess was sloppy, and Pruitt prided himself on being clean. He cracked his knuckles again as his eyes moved across the room, left hand, then right, and found the corner table. It was in the middle of this survey that Pruitt's assessment arrived at its conclusion about the 2 women at the corner table. And what the conclusion produced was the familiar and comfortable certainty of a man who has made this particular calculation many times, and has always been right, which was that 2 black women alone in his bar on a Friday night with no visible connection to anyone in the room and no reason to be cautious were exactly what they appeared to be, and that the night was about to get considerably more interesting. Lennox leaned in close to Pruitt's ear and said something low, and Pruitt's mouth moved in what might have been a smile, if a smile were defined as any expression that involves the upward movement of lip corners, regardless of what it is connected to. And he picked up his glass and began to move toward the corner table. And as he moved, he cracked his knuckles 1 more time, left, then right. And the sound was very small in the noise of the bar, but Darnell heard it from the counter, and his hand moved immediately to the monitor underneath to check the recording light, which was green, which was steady, which was exactly what it needed to be. He pulled a chair from a nearby table without asking, dragged it across the floor with the particular scraping sound of someone who has no interest in being quiet about taking what they want, and straddled it backward at the twins' table in the posture of a man who is expressing through his body that the norms of social space do not apply to him in the same direction they apply to everyone else, which is to say that the space around him belonged to him, and the space around others was simply unclaimed territory he had not yet decided to occupy. His opening words were not hostile in their surface meaning, which was part of the technique, because men like Dale Pruitt understood, whether they had ever articulated it or not, that the most effective opening move is one that forces the other person to be the one who escalates, who raises their voice or shows discomfort first, because that gives you the frame of being the reasonable one who was merely making conversation until the other party became difficult. And so he commented on how nice it was to see people enjoying the bar on a Friday night, and asked whether they were waiting for someone, with the emphasis placed on someone in a way that communicated clearly that two women alone in a bar at this hour were a thing that required explanation. Simone spoke first, because Simone always spoke first in situations like this one, which was not a rule they had ever discussed, but an understanding they had arrived at through years of working together, because Simone's voice in the first moments of a difficult conversation had a quality that bought time without conceding ground, and she said that they were not waiting for anyone, that they were having a drink, and that they appreciated him stopping by, the last phrase delivered with a finality that a reasonable person would have understood as a signal that the conversation was concluded. Dale Pruitt was not a reasonable person in the way that phrase is usually meant, which is to say, he was not someone who read other people's signals and adjusted his behavior accordingly. He was someone who read signals and used them as information about how much work the situation was going to require, and what Simone's composed politeness told him was that these were women who had not yet understood what kind of man they were talking to, which was a misunderstanding he was prepared to correct. Celine's hand tightened around her glass. A small movement, not dramatic, the kind of thing you would only notice if you were watching for it. And it was the physical expression of a calculation she was running in the same moment that looked completely different from Simone's calculation, but arrived at the same conclusion, which was that this man was exactly the kind of man they had spent 9 months building a case against, and that the night had just become something other than what it was supposed to be. Craig Lennox moved during this exchange from the position near the bar, where he had been standing, to a position behind Celine's chair, and he put his hands on the backrest with the deliberate casualness of someone demonstrating that he can put his hands wherever he wants without asking, not touching her, yet just claiming the space. And Selina felt the shift in the air behind her, the way you feel a change in temperature without turning around to verify it. Darnell Washington, behind the counter, saw all of this in the peripheral awareness of a man who has been reading his room for 22 years, and his hand moved to the monitor under the register, and his thumb confirmed the recording light, and then he moved to the far end of the counter nearest the phone. He kept there the one that was not his personal phone, and that he used for a very specific kind of call when a very specific kind of situation arose in his bar. Pruitt leaned slightly forward and introduced himself as a cop, not by name, initially just by category, and tapped the badge on his belt with one finger, in the way a man might tap a contract he wants you to read before you say anything else. And the message of the gesture was the same message the badge had been sending for 19 years in this county, which was that everything that followed was happening under a particular kind of authority, and that this fact should change the way you respond to everything that followed. Simone looked at the badge, and then looked at Pruitt's face with the expression of a woman who has been looking at badges her whole professional life, and whose relationship to the object is significantly more complicated and informed than he is going to be comfortable with. And across the table her eyes met Celine's for less than a second, and in that less than a second a conversation occurred that had no words, but was nonetheless precise. And what it said was this: yes, this is going where we think it's going, and yes, we handle it exactly the right way, and yes, we are paying attention to everything. What Dale Pruitt did over the next 20 minutes was not random, and was not even particularly creative. It was simply the execution of a pattern he had refined over 19 years of practice and understanding. The pattern requires understanding the man's fundamental belief about power, which was not that it was something you earned or demonstrated through competence, but that it was something you enforced repeatedly until the people around you stopped questioning whether you had it and simply behaved as though you did, at which point you actually had it, which in his experience was most of the time. The first stage was what could be called the entitlement layer, which was the series of comments about the twins' appearance, their clothes, their presence in the bar framed in language that presented itself as appreciation, but functioned as something else entirely, because what the comments were actually doing was establishing that he had the right to assess them, and that his assessment of them was a thing they were supposed to receive as a social fact, rather than an imposition. And when Simone responded to each one with a sentence that was polite on its surface but declined to receive the assessment as any kind of compliment, Pruitt felt the low heat that he always felt when someone failed to play their assigned role in the dynamic he was constructing. The second stage was territorial, and it emerged when Pruitt leaned back slightly and let his voice drop into the register he used when he wanted to make something sound like a statement of geography rather than a threat, and he began to tell them about the county, about whose town it was, and whose bar this was on whose night, and the specific words he chose in this moment were words he had said before in this building and in other buildings across Calhoun County. And the particular sentence that emerged with the most force, the one he said with the most deliberate weight, was this: that, in this county, the badge was the law, that there was no higher court than the badge on his belt. And he said it looking directly at Simone, who looked directly back at him and did not blink and did not speak, and the space between his words and her silence was the most charged thing in the room. Celine filed the sentence away in the part of her memory that filed things for later use, the way you save a document you know you are going to need again. The third stage was territorial in a different and more personal way, and it arrived when Pruitt mentioned their car in the parking lot by make and color information he had no reason to possess unless he had run the plates when he walked in, which meant he had made a decision about them before he ever approached their table, which meant this was not a spontaneous encounter but a chosen one, and the twins processed this information simultaneously and in silence, because they were people who had been processing dangerous information simultaneously and in silence for their entire professional lives. The fourth stage arrived when Lennox moved his hands from the backrest of Celine's chair to her shoulders, and the touch was not violent, not yet, but it was deliberate. It was a statement delivered through physical contact rather than language, and the statement was that her body was something that existed within his reach, and that his reaching was not something she had the authority to object to. And Celine went completely still, not with fear, but with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who have been trained to know the difference between the moment to act and the moment before it. And that stillness was so absolute and so unlike the stillness of a frightened person that it should have told Lennox something, but Lennox was not in the habit of reading women's stillness as anything other than submission. And so it told him nothing. Simone spoke in response to each escalation with one sentence measured precise, the kind of sentence that functions simultaneously as a warning and as evidence of a person who is not going to behave the way you expect them to behave. And Pruitt received each sentence the same way, as an obstacle, as a thing that needed to be overcome rather than a signal that needed to be heeded. Because in 19 years of doing what he did, no one in a bar in Calhoun County had ever warned him with that kind of calm and turned out to actually have the leverage to back it up. Darnell appeared at their table with an empty tray as pretext and said something about getting everyone another round, and Pruitt turned to him without taking his eyes all the way off the twins and told him to go back to his bar, and the way he said it carried within it a reference to Darnell's liquor license and a comment about paperwork that was very much overdue. And Darnell heard all of this in the tone rather than the words, and went back to his bar. But what Pruitt did not see was Darnell's hand slip beneath the counter as he went, or the small light that confirmed the recording had captured everything up to and including this moment. The bar had been thinning for the last 15 minutes, the way a room thins when people sense that something is coming and make the calculation that they would prefer not to be present for it. Chairs scraping back quietly, tabs closed with a quick gesture to Darnell, the jukebox suddenly more audible in the space left by departing bodies. Pruitt cracked his knuckles again, left then right, and Selina heard it. and in her peripheral vision saw Simone's hand move slightly toward her purse, and she moved her own hand just slightly, just enough for Simone to see it. Not yet, and Simone's hand stilled because Celine was right. It was not yet time, they did not have enough yet, and the recorder in Simone's bra needed more than an escalation at a bar table. It needed confession. It needed names. It needed the kind of self-revelation that men like Pruitt only produced when they believed they had already won. Pruitt stood up from the reversed chair and moved behind Celine's chair in the way of a man who has decided that the conversation has moved into its next phase, and he moved with the deliberate economy of someone who has done this before, not rushing, not performing for the room, simply repositioning himself the way a person repositions a tool they are about to use, and Lennox stepped to the side to give him room. And the coordination between them was the coordination of people who have executed this kind of movement together enough times that it no longer requires communication. Simone watched from across the table, and what she was doing in those 3 seconds was not panicking, and was not freezing, and was not reaching for anything. It was the rapid and precise assessment of a woman who has been trained to assess rapidly and precisely, and what the assessment produced was the understanding that they had reached the threshold that the situation was going to cross from intimidation into contact, and that the question was not whether to act, but what kind of acting would produce the outcome that served not just tonight, but the 9 months of work that had preceded tonight. Pruitt struck Celine across the back of her head with an open hand. Hard. The kind of blow that a certain type of man tells himself is not really violence, because it is open-handed, because it leaves no mark. You can see immediately, because it is not a fist, but that carries within it all the contempt and all the domination that those distinctions are designed to obscure, and the sound of it in the now nearly empty bar was sharp and flat and ugly, and a woman at the far end of the counter made a sound and then went silent. Celine's vision went white at the edges for half a second, which was the physiological response to a sharp blow to the head, and then it came back with a clarity that was different from ordinary clarity, the kind of heightened sensory precision that the body produces in moments of genuine threat when it is pulling all its resources into the present. And she rose from the chair in a single controlled movement and turned to face him. And what was on her face was not rage, because rage was not what she felt. What she felt was recognition, the cold and complete recognition of exactly the kind of man she was looking at, and exactly what was going to happen to him. And the only question in her mind was when. Simone's hand moved toward her purse, and Celine's came up from her side the barest perceptible lift of 3 fingers. Not yet. And Simone's hand stopped because the signal was correct, because what they needed more than the satisfaction of what Celine could have done to Dale Pruitt in the next 10 seconds was what Dale Pruitt was going to give them in the next several hours if they stayed in character and let him believe he had won. Pruitt read Celine's controlled response as defiance, because it did not look like any of the responses he was accustomed to producing in people. And defiance was the category his mind reached for when people failed to display fear. And defiance was something he had a procedure for, which was the arrest. And he announced it with the practiced authority of a man who has said these words so many times they have become pure reflex. The charges assembling themselves automatically from the repertoire he kept: ready disorderly conduct threatening an officer, failure to comply, the standard architecture of a fabricated arrest that he had built over a dozen times, and that had never in 19 years been successfully challenged. Lennox cuffed them both, and he did it in the way he had been trained by Pruitt to do it, which was with the deliberate application of slightly more pressure than was necessary, because the slight excess of pressure was not incidental, it was communicative. It was the physical vocabulary of a system, telling someone what their status was within it, and the cuffs went on. Celine's wrists too tight, and she felt the bite of the metal and said nothing, and the not saying anything was its own kind of statement more eloquent than anything she could have spoken. Simone, hands behind her back, looked at Pruitt across the table with the direct and level gaze of a woman who has interviewed dangerous people in small rooms and maintained eye contact throughout. And she said three things: her name, which was not her real name, but the name on the cover identity she had been using for 9 months in proximity to this county; the fact that he was making a mistake; and the fact that she wanted him to remember this exact moment, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a statement. She was filing for later. The way you note a time on a document you are going to submit to a court. Pruitt laughed, and the laugh was the laugh of a man who has heard variations of that particular sentence many times and has never yet encountered a circumstance in which it turned out to be true, because in Calhoun County the badge had been the law for 19 years, and the badge was still on his belt, and so he moved them toward the door. Darnell at the counter did not move, but his hand beneath the register surface was already sending the text he had pre-composed 3 hours ago and stored in his drafts for exactly this contingency to a number that was not in his contacts under a name, but under a symbol. And the text had 4 words that meant something specific to the person receiving it. And after he sent it, he looked up at Selena as she was being pushed past the counter, and she looked back at him. And he gave her the smallest nod in the inventory of nods available to a human face. And what the nod said was, "I have it all. I have had it all, since the moment he walked in, and you are not as alone as he thinks you are." The door swung open, and the October night came in, and Simone and Celine Carter were marched out of the bar with their hands behind their backs, and behind them the door closed, and the remaining 2 patrons in the room looked at each other and looked at Darnell. And nobody said anything because in Calhoun County, the education of knowing when not to speak had been earned over many years, and at considerable cost. The Calhoun County Police Department's main station was a building that had been constructed in 1974 and had been renovated twice since in ways that had updated its electrical systems and its evidence processing room, without doing anything meaningful to the quality of air it contained or the particular institutional smell of it, which was the layered and specific smell of fluorescent lighting and linoleum, and stale coffee, and something underneath all of that which was harder to name but which Simone, who had been in many rooms like this one, would have described as the smell of authority that does not expect to be questioned. The booking sergeant was a man in his late 50s, who processed the twins with the efficiency of someone who had been doing the same motions for so long they required no engagement from the part of him that made decisions, and he typed and asked questions and recorded answers and did not look at Simone and Celine in the way you do not look at things you have chosen not to see, which is a choice that requires over time significant internal maintenance, and which this man appeared to have been maintaining for long enough that the effort had become invisible even to himself. Pruitt performed during the booking in the way he always performed, narrating the charges as he wrote them down, adding details with the casual fluency of someone improvising on a theme they have played many times, inventing small elaborations that made the story internally consistent, and that would look on paper like the kind of specific observational detail that suggests careful and accurate record-keeping. And Lennox stood beside him and confirmed each charge when Pruitt looked at him, the call and response of a performance they had rehearsed until it was seamless. Chief Warren Stills arrived at 11:45, and his arrival was the opposite of Pruitt's in nearly every way quiet, where Pruitt was loud-measured, where Pruitt was emphatic, dressed with the particular neatness of a man who maintains his appearance as a form of statement about who is and is not in control of a situation, and his silver hair was combed and his collar was straight. Even at this hour, which was a detail that was not accidental, and that communicated to anyone paying attention that this man had been awake and prepared, that the call had not surprised him, that whatever happened in his station happened with his knowledge and his approval. He addressed Simone and Selena with a courtesy that was more unsettling than Pruitt's aggression, because it was the courtesy of a man who does not need to be hostile because he does not believe you have the ability to hurt him. And he said that he understood there had been some difficulty at Darnell's bar this evening, and that he hoped nobody was too uncomfortable, and that he wanted to offer what he described as a clarifying conversation about what their options were. And the word options in the mouth of a man who has already decided what is going to happen is one of the most specific forms of threat available in the English language. The offer was as follows. They could accept citations for the charges Pruitt had filed, accept a conditional release in the morning, agree to leave the county within 48 hours, and the matter would be closed and the citations would be administratively cleared within 60 days and he left the or to do its work in the air between them without completing the sentence, because completing it would have made it a threat, and Stills was too careful to make threats when implications served the same purpose with none of the liability. Selene looked at him for 5 seconds without speaking, and at the end of 5 seconds she said that she appreciated the offer, but that she was not going to take it, and she said it in a tone that did not perform defiance or courage, but simply stated a fact the way you state that you are not hungry when someone offers you food. And Stills looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating, slightly not alarmed, not yet, but noting that the response was not the one his experience had led him to anticipate. He smiled, and the smile was the smile of a man who has decided that the recalibration is minor, and that his assessment of the situation remains essentially correct, and he said good night and turned and left. And Pruitt waited until the sound of his footsteps in the corridor had faded before allowing himself to relax into the satisfaction of a man whose chief has just validated everything he has done. Simone went into cell 3 and Selene went into cell 4. The cells separated by a shared wall with a gap of bars at the top through which they maintained sightline, and the cell doors closed with the mechanical sound of locks engaging. And then the corridor was quiet, and the fluorescent light above the cells buzzed at the particular frequency of fluorescent lights in old buildings, and for a moment both of them simply breathed. What the pat-down had missed was not the result of a sophisticated concealment, but the result of a simple failure of imagination, because Dale Pruitt had searched the twins the way he searched everyone he brought in, which was for weapons, for contraband, for anything that could hurt him physically, or create a legal problem for him in the short term, because those were the categories of things that his experience had taught him to look for, and his imagination, operating within the limits that 19 years of unchallenged authority had imposed on it, had never extended to the category of things that might be used to build a federal case against him, because in his operational reality that category did not exist. Simone's micro-recording device was embedded in the underwire structure of her bra, designed to be indistinguishable from the structural element it mimicked to any search that did not involve removing the garment entirely, which a standard field pat-down did not, and which Pruitt's pat-down most certainly had not. And the device had been running since the moment Pruitt approached their table at the bar, capturing everything from the scrape of his chair, being dragged across the floor to the fabricated charges being read aloud during booking, in a quality of audio reproduction that would be described by the federal prosecutor who later presented it as simply extraordinary. The device had been standard protocol for Simone for the last 3 months ever since the investigation had moved into the phase where proximity to the Pruitt network became regular, and the operational risk of that proximity made continuous documentation not just prudent but necessary, and she had worn it every day including tonight, which she and Selene had intended to be a night off, but which had become in the way that life operating close to a 9-month investigation sometimes did something else entirely. Selene's hidden asset was different in nature, not a device but a protocol, a specific procedure she had committed to memory before they left the apartment this evening, the way a pilot commits an emergency procedure to memory, which was the contact information and authentication codes for Deputy Director James Chen at the Department of Justice's Internal Affairs Division, a separate oversight structure from the FBI chain of command, and one that existed precisely for situations where the FBI chain of command itself had been compromised, which was a contingency that Simone had identified 3 months ago when the investigation had begun to surface evidence that their direct supervisor, Leonard Marsh, was not simply failing to provide adequate oversight of the Pruitt network, but was actively protecting it. They could have revealed their identities when Pruitt cuffed them at the bar and ended the immediate situation, could have shown their real credentials, and watched Pruitt's face do the thing faces do when they understand what has just happened, could have walked out of the bar within the hour and been debriefed by morning, and had the satisfaction of watching Pruitt's night end badly in a very immediate and visible way. But revealing themselves at the bar would have given Stills and Marsh the advance notice they needed to begin the process of evidence destruction and witness intimidation that men in their position had developed into a refined art form over many years, and it would have produced the arrest of Pruitt and possibly Lennox while leaving intact the broader network. Stills's political connections, Marsh's FBI access to financial arrangements with local real estate developers, the judges whose cooperation had made the whole machine possible, and dismantling Dale Pruitt without dismantling the machine he operated within would have been the equivalent of removing one gear from an engine and calling it fixed. They needed Pruitt on record in his natural environment, talking to people he trusted, believing himself to be in complete control of a situation that was, in fact, the last trap that would ever close around him, and that meant staying in the cells, and that meant being for as long as necessary exactly what Pruitt believed they were, two women who had been taught their place and were in the process of accepting it. Simone lay on the cell cot in the fluorescent hum, and the institutional smell, and touched the scar on her left palm with the thumb of her right hand, the way she always touched it when she was making a calculation about whether what she was doing was worth what it was costing her. And the last time she had made that calculation in a room like this one, it had been in Memphis in 2009, and she had stayed longer than she should have, and the door had closed at the wrong moment, and she had carried the result on her palm ever since. She had stayed then because the work required it, and she had been right. And the person whose freedom that work had produced was a woman whose name she still knew. And the cost of the scar was a cost she would pay again, and had paid again over the years on different occasions, and would pay again tonight, and in the hours ahead, because the calculation always came out the same way, which was that the work was worth it, and that the scar was not a warning, but a reminder of the reason. Paula Reeves came on the midnight shift, and the first thing she did after signing in and getting her assignment was walk the holding area to check on the occupants, which was standard procedure, and which she would have done regardless, but which tonight carried a specific additional weight, because she had seen the booking log when she came in, and the names on it, the cover names, not the real ones, which she did not know had triggered in her, a response that was partly professional instinct and partly the specific and accumulated discomfort of 3 years of watching Dale Pruitt operate and knowing exactly what the booking log meant when his name was on it as the arresting officer for 2 women detained on a Friday night. She was 29 years old and had been with the department for 3 years, and she had come to the job with the particular idealism of someone who had grown up in this county, who knew its neighborhoods and its people, who had watched the gap between what the department said it did and what it actually did widen over the course of her childhood into something that could no longer be described as a gap, but had to be called something larger. And she had believed when she joined that being inside the institution was a better position from which to address that gap than being outside it, and she had spent 3 years revising that belief without abandoning it entirely. She had an encrypted drive in a safety deposit box at the First National Bank of Calhoun County that contained 14 months of documentation dates, victim names, descriptions of incidents she had witnessed, or that had been reported to her by people in the community who had no one else to tell, photographs she had taken on her personal phone from her patrol car records of arrests that did not make sense at the departmental level and made complete sense at the Pruitt level. And she had built this file the way you build something you know you are going to need but do not yet know when or for whom, which is carefully and consistently and without telling anyone. She checked the corridor twice before approaching the cells, a behavior that looked like thoroughness to anyone watching, and was in fact the behavior of a woman who understood that in this building at this hour, The walls had been known to have ears that reported in the wrong direction, and she approached Simone's cell first with a cup of water and 2 paper bags with the sandwiches that passed for a meal in the holding section of the Calhoun County Police Department. The exchange of the cup and the bag through the bars lasted approximately 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds something else changed hands. A small piece of paper folded to the size of a thumbnail, pressed between the cup and Simone's palm, with the practiced smoothness of a woman who had been figuring out how to pass things to people in ways that did not look like passing for most of her professional life, and Simone's fingers closed around it with no visible change in her expression. And Reeves moved on to Celine's cell and did the same thing with the bag and a second cup. The paper contained a name, a phone number, and a code phrase. Deputy Director James Chen, DOJ Internal Affairs Emergency Protocol 7, which was the DOJ oversight mechanism that existed outside the FBI chain of command, and that Reeves had researched 8 months ago, not knowing whether she would ever be in a position to use the information, simply knowing that she needed to know it existed. She said at a volume audible to anyone in the corridor, but with her back partially turned so that her face was not visible. If anyone checked the camera they thought was recording that she had been documenting the department's behavior for 14 months, that what was happening to these women had happened before to other women, and that she could name 3 specific victims without pausing to remember them: a 67-year-old grandmother named Mabel Delaney, whose grandson Marcus was currently serving year 8 of a 12-year sentence on a cocaine possession charge that Reeves had personally witnessed the evidence being prepared for. A man named Theodore Brown, who had paid Pruitt $600 a month for 3 years and had still had his liquor license suspended when he refused to increase the amount, and a high school English teacher named Dana Ferris, who had filed a formal complaint against Lennox after witnessing him assault a student and who had lost her position within 30 days of filing it. She told them she did not know who they were, or why they were really in this bar on this night, but that they were not afraid of Dale Pruitt in the specific way that people who did not have a reason to be unafraid of Dale Pruitt were not afraid of him, and that this told her something and that she was choosing to act on what it told her. And she left before they could respond because the sound of the night sergeant's chair moving at the far end of the building told her she had approximately 12 seconds before his sight line would include the corridor. She left the cell log open to a blank page as she went, and Simone looked at the blank page and understood, and she took the note and read it twice, and then tore it into small pieces and swallowed them with the water. And in the cell next to hers, Celine was lying on her cot, with her eyes closed and her breathing slow and even, and her left hand, out of the sight line of the camera position Celine had already mapped, was moving in the small rhythmic pattern of 3 slow taps on the metal frame of the cot, and Simone tapped back once, which meant, "I have what we need. I have the contact. The next move is ours." The station settled after 2 in the morning, with the particular settling of institutional buildings when the official business of the day has ended and the unofficial business begins, which is a different kind of quiet than the quiet of a place where nothing is happening. It is the quiet of a place where things are happening that are not supposed to be observed, and the fluorescent lights in the break room adjacent to the holding area stayed on, and the sound of a chair dragged across linoleum, and the sound of glass on a table came through the corridor with the clarity that old buildings provide when there are very few other sounds to compete with it. Pruitt's voice came first, and then Lennox's, and then the sound of ice cubes in glasses, and both twins went completely still on their cots. Simone with her eyes open, and Celine with her eyes closed, and neither of them moved anything except their breathing, which they controlled with the deliberate slowness of women who understood that what was about to happen required them to be as close to invisible as it was possible to be in a space you occupied. The confession did not announce itself as a confession, which is how the best confessions work. It arrived as conversation, the kind of late-night conversation that bourbon enables in men who have spent the day performing a version of themselves, and who need in private to be the actual version. And what emerged from the break room over the next hour and 20 minutes was the actual version of Dale Pruitt, which was a man who was proud of what he did in a way he was rarely able to express in public, and who in this particular private moment was expressing it with the unguarded fluency of a man who believes completely that the room he is in does not have ears. The first layer of what he said was about his method, the technique he had developed over the years for identifying the right targets, the cars that were too nice for the neighborhood, the women alone, the young men driving at night, the people who had assets but no connections, and he described his technique the way a craftsman describes his tools, with familiarity, and with something in his voice that was the closest word available to affection. And the micro-recorder in Simone's bra captured every syllable in the clear, digital quality of a device that cost more than Pruitt's monthly salary. The second layer was where the names appeared, and the names were the names that Reeves had given them. Mabel Delaney's grandson, and Theodore Brown and Dana Ferris, and others they had not heard before. And for each name, Pruitt had a story, and in each story the structure was the same. A target identified an approach, designed an outcome. Engineered an institution, weaponized a life. Altered in ways the person affected could not trace back to a single decision made in a break room over bourbon, because the institution that made it possible had been designed to be untraceable. The third layer was the one that opened the network, because Pruitt's voice carried in this particular hour of the night, in this particular private conversation, the confidence of a man who trusts his audience completely, and he began to name the people who made the whole thing work. Stills, who provided the cover and the discipline and the political connections that insulated the operation from the kinds of scrutiny that had in other counties produced the kinds of outcomes that Dale Pruitt wanted no part of. And he named 2 officers in addition to Lennox who participated in the shakedown operations. And he described in language that was general enough to function as implication, but specific enough to function as confession, the financial arrangements that distributed the proceeds of 11 years of deeply embedded predation among the people who made it possible. The fourth layer arrived when Lennox asked a question about the FBI inquiries that had been opened and closed in the past 3 years, the 2 federal investigations that had somehow never gotten traction. And Pruitt's answer was the one that completed the architecture of everything Simone had been building for 9 months, because the answer named Leonard Marsh, the deputy director of the FBI's regional field office, the twins' direct superior, and described in specific detail the arrangement that had been in place for 3 years, the sealed 2019 misconduct file that Marsh needed buried, and the federal inquiries that Marsh had made disappear in exchange for that burial. And the arrangement described was conspiracy and obstruction of justice, and the compromise of a federal oversight function, and every word of it was going on to the recording. The fifth layer was when Pruitt said the line again, the sentence about the badge being the law, the sentence that had first appeared at the bar and that had reappeared in different forms throughout the evening. And this version was the most unguarded and the most complete, spoken in the break room of his own station drunk on bourbon, and certainty to a room he believed was private, that there was no higher court than the badge that anyone who thought there was had never spent a night in Calhoun County understanding how things actually worked, that the badge was the law, and the law was him, and the 2 of them had been the same thing for 19 years, and he did not have any expectation that this was going to change. Simone lay on the cot and breathed, and the recorder caught it all. And in the adjacent cell, Celine's hand moved against the metal frame of the cot in the 3-tap pattern that meant, "I know you have it." And Simone tapped back once, which meant, "I have it all." And the room was quiet, except for the fluorescent hum, and the ice in the glasses in the break room, and the distant sound of Dale Pruitt laughing at something Craig Lennox said, the laughter of a man who has no idea that the thing he has spent 19 years building has just handed someone the blueprint for taking it apart. The laughter faded down the corridor sometime after 4 in the morning, and the break room light went off, and the station went into the deep quiet of the pre-dawn hours, and Simone opened her eyes fully in the darkness of cell 3, and allowed herself the smallest and coldest smile that had crossed her face in the entire 9 months of this investigation, because what was on the recorder was not just sufficient for the case against Dale Pruitt. It was the complete case against all of them, and she had it, and it was going nowhere, and the only question now was how to get it out. Darnell Washington closed the bar at 2 in the morning, and he did it in the order. He always did it. Neon signs first, then the kitchen lock, then the register count, then the chairs up on the tables. Because the routine was the routine, and the routine existed, in part because deviation from the routine was the kind of thing that people who were watching noticed, and on nights like this one, Darnell was aware in the specific and practiced way of a man who had been navigating the space between Pruitt's authority and his own survival for 4 years that the possibility of being watched was not zero. When the last regular had been out the door for 20 minutes, and the street outside was empty, and the only light was the working light he kept on over the bar when he was counting, Darnell reached under the register and found the phone he kept there, not his personal phone, a second one, a prepaid one that he kept charged and that he had told no one about, that existed for this specific category of situation and no other. He reviewed the footage on the security monitor before he did anything else, all 4 feeds from the moment Pruitt and Lennox had walked in, to the moment the door closed behind Simone and Celine, and the patrol car pulled out of the lot, and what he saw on the monitor was what he had known was there, but that seeing made real in a different way, which was the entire story from the approach to the assault, to the handcuffing, to the march out in the specific and unambiguous quality of a system that had been recording continuously for 4 years, and that had been designed from the beginning to produce exactly this kind of record. He called Cassandra Okafor, and she answered on the second ring because Cassandra Okafor had been waiting 14 months for a call from a number she did not have saved in her contacts, but that she had memorized because she had learned in 14 months of working this particular investigation that the people who mattered in a story like this one were not the people who called from numbers you had saved. He told her what he had, and she told him what she had. And between the two of them, in the space of a 4-minute phone call, the outline of a case that was larger than either of them had independently understood became visible for the first time, because Darnell had the video evidence, and Cassandra had 14 months of financial records and correspondence that traced the money from the shakedowns through Pruitt to Stills, and from Stills outward into a network of real estate transactions and political contributions that represented 11 years of the same predatory operation being laundered through the institutions of the county until it looked from a distance like ordinary commerce. He sent her an encrypted clip of 12 minutes covering the core of the bar footage, and then he called a second number, and the second number belonged to Judge Raymond Schultz, who had been a federal circuit judge for 22 years, and who had been retired for 7, and who had been keeping a private dossier in a fireproof safe in his study for 9 years, waiting for the right lever, and who answered the phone with the unhurried calm of a man who has known that a call like this one was coming and has been prepared for it for long enough that the preparation has become its own form of peace. Darnell told him what he had sent Cassandra, and Schultz said 3 words that Darnell had not expected to hear, said quite that simply, which were that he was ready, and they agreed on a meeting time and a location. And then they ended the call, and Darnell Washington sat for a moment in the working light of his closed bar with the security monitor showing 4 empty quadrants and the October night outside his windows, and the weight of 4 years of holding this particular thing in the particular way you hold something when you know its moment has not arrived yet, but you also know that it will. And he exhaled once slowly, and then he got up and turned off the light and got in his truck. He did not go home, because home was an address that Dale Pruitt knew, and this was not the night to be at an address that Dale Pruitt knew. And so he drove to his sister's house 3 miles in the other direction, and called her from outside to tell her he was coming. And as he pulled away from the bar, he looked at it in the rearview mirror for a long moment, the building that had been his for 22 years, and that was about to become something different. Not less his, but more than itself, and he kept driving. The morning shift began to filter in at 6, and Paula Reeves, working the overnight end of her shift, created the window with a maintenance problem she reported to the desk sergeant, with the practiced nonchalance of a woman who had been looking for exactly this kind of small bureaucratic opening, and had not had to wait long for one to present itself, which was a camera in the cell block corridor showing a fault light on the monitoring panel, a thing that required her to go to the maintenance closet for the manual reset, which took her past the file room, which had a landline phone and which bought her approximately 4 unobserved minutes. She moved the twins in sequence, Simone first, under the pretense of processing a form that required a signature in a specific room. Then Celine 2 minutes later, and the file room smelled of dust and old paper, and the particular musty density of documents that had not been accessed in years, and would not be accessed for more years after this. And the phone on the desk in the corner was the kind of phone that had been installed when the building was renovated in 1994. And that still worked because the department had never gotten around to removing it, and because sometimes the oldest infrastructure is the most reliable. Simone dialed the number from Reeves's note, the DOJ Internal Affairs direct line, and the night duty officer who answered transferred her to Deputy Director Chen in under 90 seconds, which told her that the Protocol 7 alert had been flagged, that Chen's line was live for this category of call, that the DOJ knew more than she had expected them to know. Chen's voice was the voice of a man who had been waiting for this call, in the specific sense of a man who has been building toward a moment for long enough that when the moment arrives, he is already in motion. And he told her what the DOJ had on their end without preamble. Marsh's financial records going back 4 years, the sealed 2019 misconduct file that had been the foundation of his arrangement with Stills, 3 years of case closures that correlated with the Pruitt Network's operational calendar, with a precision that eliminated coincidence as an explanation. And the one thing they were missing, which was the inside audio that would make the financial and procedural evidence into something that a jury could understand, without needing to be a financial forensics expert to follow. When Simone told him about the recording device, Chen went quiet for 3 seconds, and 3 seconds of silence from a DOJ deputy director in the middle of an emergency protocol call is a meaningful quantity of silence. And when he spoke again, his voice had a quality in it that Simone recognized as the controlled version of something larger, which was the recognition that the piece they had been missing had been sitting in a cell in Calhoun County since midnight. He gave her 2 instructions. Keep the device safe. Do not attempt to leave the station on their own, because the extraction team he was assembling had to bypass the FBI communications network entirely to avoid Marsh's access, which added time, which meant the team was 6 hours out from the call, and he said 6 hours in a tone that communicated that he understood what 6 hours in that building meant, and that he was moving as fast as the protocol would allow. Reeves appeared in the door with 4 words. Someone's come and go, and Simone said 2 words back to Chen, understood, moving, and the line ended, and they were back in the corridor in under 30 seconds, and they were in their cells with the doors properly closed before the footsteps in the main corridor belonged to anyone who was paying attention to the file room. Pruitt appeared at the cell door 11 minutes later, and he was holding a phone that was not his department phone, and he was wearing the expression of a man who has just received a piece of information that has completed a satisfying pattern in his understanding of events, and he held up the phone to show them a text message. And the text message was from Leonard Marsh, and it said in the flat and careful language of a man communicating and writing something he would prefer not to be communicating and writing, but has judged to be necessary that the 2 women in custody were known problem agents, that the situation should be handled locally, and that he had managed the situation on the federal end. Pruitt read the message aloud in the tone of a man reciting evidence in his own favor, which it was, and he said that their own supervisor had confirmed what he had suspected, and that this meant they were further from help than they had perhaps believed when they were sitting in their bar being difficult, and the satisfaction in his voice was the satisfaction of a man who has just watched the last door close. Simone stood at the bars of cell 3 and looked at Dale Pruitt and said nothing, and she touched the scar on her left palm with her thumb. And what she was feeling in that moment was not fear and was not defeat, and was not the particular variety of despair that Pruitt believed he was producing in her, but was something more precise, which was the crystalline clarity of a woman who now had, in addition to everything else she had accumulated over 9 months, the confirmation she had needed about Leonard Marsh delivered in writing by Marsh himself to a phone that Pruitt was holding up to show her, which meant it existed in the phone's message history, which meant it was evidence, which meant the case had just grown by 1 count of obstruction delivered as a gift by a man too arrogant to understand that the situation he believed he was managing had already managed him. The hours between 4 in the morning and the first light are the hours that separate people who have been trained to endure from people who have not, and what Simone and Celine Carter demonstrated in those hours was not heroism, which is a category that requires an audience, but something quieter and more durable, which was simply the continuation of professional discipline in conditions that were designed to erode it. Simone did not sleep, and Celine slept in the 20-minute increments she had learned in the years of field work that required sleep to be rationed rather than sought. And neither of them spoke because the walls of a building built in 1974 carried sound in ways that its architects had not designed for, and its current occupants had not bothered to map, and the margins of safety available to them in the current situation did not include unguarded conversation. Pruitt came to check on them at 4:30 and again at 5:15, and both times he stood in the corridor outside their cells and looked at them with the expression of a man monitoring a process he has initiated, checking for the indicators of progress. He expects to see fear tears the visible collapse of dignity that he had learned to read as the successful completion of the kind of night he was running. And both times he found instead 2 women lying on their cots in the particular stillness that had nothing in common with the stillness of broken people, and that he was not equipped to correctly interpret, and both times he left with a slight wrongness in his step that he would not have been able to name, but that was the physical expression of a man who expected a result and received the absence of a result, and could not reconcile the absence with his model of the situation. Lennox came once at 5, and he stood at the bars of Celine's cell for longer than a check required, and what was on his face was something different from Pruitt's satisfaction, something more like the expression of a man who has begun to notice that a situation is not quite what it was described to him as being the low-grade cognitive dissonance of someone whose intuition is sending a signal that his loyalty to Pruitt is preventing him from consciously processing. And Celine lay on her cot and breathed, and gave him nothing, which was the correct response because giving him nothing made the dissonance louder in the place inside him where it was building. At 5:43, the first gray light came through the high narrow window of cell 3, at the angle of a late October sunrise, and Simone watched it arrive on the concrete wall, and held the calculation in her mind 3 hours and 43 minutes since the call to Chen. 6 hours from the call was 9 in the morning. The extraction team was coming to the station. They would find empty cells if something happened before 9. The window problem was real, and the situation was going to move before the window closed, because Dale Pruitt had been drinking for 6 hours and had been nursing a festering resentment of 2 women who had refused to break for 7, and men in that condition, in Simone's experience, did not wait for morning to make their next move. She tapped 3 times on the metal frame of her cot and across the wall. Celine tapped back twice, which meant, "I know I'm ready." And the gray light moved on the concrete wall, and the station began to produce the earliest sounds of a building waking up. And at 5:52, the sound of keys in the corridor was not the sound of a check, but the sound of a decision being executed. Pruitt came down the corridor at 5:52, with Lennox behind him, and the quality of his movement was different from the previous check visits, less surveillance and more intention, the walk of a man who has made up his mind about something, and is now in the process of carrying it out. And when he stopped outside the cells, he did not speak immediately, but stood with his hands at his sides and looked at them with the flat look of a man who has moved past the phase of the evening that involved words. He cracked his knuckles one last time, left hand, then right, and then he announced the transfer. He called it a processing requirement that had to be handled at a different facility, and the specificity of the language was the language of legitimacy applied to something that was not legitimate. And the not naming of the facility was the part of the announcement that contained the actual information, because the not naming meant the facility was not a facility, but a location, and the location was not on any departmental record, and the transfer was not a transfer, but a removal. Celine stepped to the bars of her cell and asked clearly at a volume that she had calibrated to carry through the recording device, and to be captured in its clearest possible quality, where they were being taken, and under whose authority, and what the departmental case number was for the transfer. And she asked these questions not because she expected truthful answers, but because the asking of the questions and the responses to them were themselves evidence, the documentary record of a transfer conducted without proper authorization that would matter in the proceedings that were coming. Pruitt did not answer any of the questions and opened the cells and pulled them out. And the movement into the back corridor was faster than previous movements had been the back stairwell exit rather than the main corridor, the service door rather than the front entrance and outside the building. In the gray pre-dawn light of 5:58, a white unmarked van was running in the parking lot, with no one visible through the front windshield from the angle of the service door. Simone walked toward the van and counted seconds in her head, because counting seconds was a discipline that had been useful to her in many previous situations, and that her body defaulted to in moments of high operational stress, and the thing she was counting was the gap between 5:58 and 900, which was the difference between the moment she was in and the moment when Chen's team would arrive at the station and find 2 empty cells and understand that the situation had moved out of the building. They were loaded into the back of the van. The doors closed, the sound of the engine shifting as the vehicle began to move, and Simone sat in the darkness of the van and felt the recording device against her ribs, and understood that wherever they were being taken, the device was still running, and would continue running, and that this was not the end of the night but simply its relocation, and that what was needed now was not rescue but time, and that she and Celine had between them enough training and enough mutual intelligence and enough controlled fury to make time if time was what was needed. She felt Celine's shoulder against hers in the darkness, and Celine's hand found hers for one moment and squeezed once and then released, and they were in the dark together, heading somewhere that would turn out to be the last mistake Dale Pruitt ever made in his career. 25 minutes of driving, which Simone counted in real time with enough accuracy to reconstruct the route from the turns and the road surface quality and the sound of the environment through the van's walls, which shifted from the acoustic quality of a town to the acoustic quality of open land at approximately the 12-minute mark, and from open land to something more enclosed at the 20-minute mark, which told her they had entered some kind of structure or approached one. And when the van stopped and the back doors opened, the smell confirmed it, standing water and rust, and the particular sweetness of organic decay that belongs to abandoned industrial spaces. The smell of a place that was once used for a specific purpose, and has been waiting since that purpose ended for someone to find a new use for it. The warehouse was a long, low, corrugated metal building at the end of an unpaved access road that did not appear on the county's maintained road inventory, because it was not on the county's maintained road inventory, and its windows had been broken out at some point in the past decade and never replaced, and the loading dock at the eastern end had partially collapsed, and the moonlight that came through the gaps in the roof was the broken silver light of a place that had been left to deteriorate by degrees so gradual that each individual degree was invisible, and the accumulation was only apparent from the outside. Simone and Celine were positioned on overturned oil drums in the center of the warehouse floor, back-to-back hands still cuffed, and the arrangement was deliberate in the way that Dale Pruitt's arrangements were always deliberate, which was not from any tactical training but from the specific kind of applied intuition that emerges from doing something enough times to develop preferences about how it goes. Pruitt's energy in the warehouse was different from his energy at the bar. Different even from his energy at the station, because those were public spaces that required the maintenance of a surface, the performance of an officer, the management of observers. And this was a private space, the kind of space where the surface could drop, and what was underneath the surface in the warehouse light and the pre-dawn quiet was something quieter and uglier and more honest than anything that had been on display since he walked into Darnell's bar. He talked in the way men talk when they believe they have an audience that cannot leave, which is with the expansiveness of someone who has been holding something in and is now finally in a room where it is safe to let it out. And what came out was the philosophy underneath the philosophy, the one that did not use the language of order and law and county management, but simply and nakedly said what it was, which was that he believed certain people needed to be kept in certain places, and that this was not a crime but a calling, and that he had been answering it for 19 years, and was proud of having answered it and did not intend to stop. He said the sentence again. The badge is the law sentence. The sentence that had been born at the bar table, and grown larger in the break room, and arrived here in the warehouse at its most naked and most permanent form, that there was no higher court than the badge on his belt, that anyone who wanted to find one was going to spend a long time looking, and that in this county and in every county, like this county, the badge was not a symbol of authority but the thing itself, and that the two women sitting back to back on oil drums in front of him were welcome to go find their higher court if they could, and he would be here when they got back from looking. The recorder was still running. Simone felt it against her ribs, and noted with the part of her mind that had been running continuous calculations for the past 8 hours that the device's battery life was rated at 12 hours from activation, and that she had activated it at the bar table at approximately 8:15 the previous evening, and that it was now approximately 6:20 in the morning, which meant the device had been running for approximately 10 hours, and had approximately 2 hours of battery remaining, which was more than sufficient. There was also a function built into the recording device that Simone had set before leaving the apartment the previous evening, which was the burst upload protocol. If the device lost contact with its registered base station, the encrypted router in the apartment on the county line for a period of 90 minutes or longer, it would automatically compress and upload everything it had recorded to the FBI evidence management system under the case number that only Simone and Chen had access to, bypassing the normal submission pathway, and depositing directly into the secure evidentiary archive where Marsh could not reach it regardless of his access level. The device had lost contact with the apartment router at approximately 4:30 in the morning, when the van pulled out of the station parking lot and drove beyond the rotor's effective range, and the 90-minute clock had started at that moment, and it would complete its count at 6 o'clock in the morning, meaning that at 6 o'clock, everything on the device, the bar, the booking, the drunk confession, the Marsh revelation, the fabricated transfer, the warehouse monologue, all of it would upload to the Federal Archive in a single encrypted burst transmission that no one in Calhoun County had the authority or the technical access to intercept or delete. It was 5:47 when they were brought into the warehouse. Simone tapped 3 times against Selena's wrist, very small, and Celine tapped back, "When you move, I move." Celine moved before Pruitt finished his sentence, and the movement was not the explosive, sudden movement of desperation, but the economical initiation of a person executing a plan. And the first thing she did was the wrist rotation she had practiced in defensive tactics training until it was as automatic as breathing, which involved dropping her weight slightly, rotating her wrists outward against the cuff mechanism, and applying lateral pressure at the specific angle that pushed the ratchet to its outermost tooth, which gave her 2 inches of movement, which was enough. She was on her feet before Lennox registered that she was moving. Lennox was the faster threat. She addressed him first, 2 steps toward him as he lunged forward, which meant she was inside his reach before his reach arrived, and she used the oil drum behind her as a pivot point, and redirected his forward momentum into the corrugated wall. And the sound he made when he hit, it was the sound of a large man meeting a metal surface at full speed without the preparation to absorb the impact. Pruitt moved toward her with the size and the anger of a man who has been operating from the position of complete control, and has just watched it change in less than 3 seconds. And he was faster than his bulk suggested, but slower than he needed to be. And Simone, who Celine had released from her cuffs using Pruitt's own belt key, in the 2 seconds when Lennox was occupying his attention, came from the left. At the moment he reached Celine, and what happened in the next 40 seconds was not graceful and was not clean, and was not the choreographed efficiency of a training exercise, but was the controlled and effective violence of 2 women who had been training for situations like this one for 12 years, and who had the additional advantage of being entirely sober in a confrontation with 2 men who were not. Pruitt landed one hit, an open-handed strike to Selena's left shoulder that spun her, and she converted the spin into rotational force, and the force into a strike that caught him at the jaw, with the full kinetic transfer of a body that knew exactly how to do this, and his knees went, and he went with them, and by the time his hands came up to catch himself, Simone had his wrists and the handcuffs from his belt were closing around them, with the mechanical sound of the ratchet that had been making that sound in this county for 19 years, in a direction that now ran the other way. Lennox tried twice more from his position near the wall, and both times the available force was less than what he needed, because he had not recovered from the impact, and because the twins had put themselves between him and any advantage. And the second time he came up, Celine put him back down with a precision that drew no more from her than the situation required, and then he stayed down. Simone retrieved Pruitt's radio from his belt and his personal phone from his jacket pocket, and she stood over him in the warehouse with the gray morning light coming through the holes in the roof and the October air coming through the broken windows. And the recorder was still running. And at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, the DOJ notification system delivered its alert to Chen's phone. And 4 seconds later, Chen's call came in on Pruitt's phone, which Simone answered, and the voice on the line was the voice of a man who had received a packet of audio evidence 4 seconds ago and who was calling because he needed to know where she was, and Simone told him. Simone gave Chen the GPS coordinates from Pruitt's phone, and Chen read them back to confirm, and then said that the extraction team was 17 minutes out, and that they were coming with DOJ Tactical and 2 county line agents who had been staged on the perimeter since 3 in the morning. And he said this last part in a way that told her that the 6 hours he had quoted her in the file room had been the conservative estimate, and that he had in fact been moving pieces since the moment her call connected, and he understood what he was dealing with. While she was on the phone, Pruitt attempted the conversation that men in his position attempt when the physical dimension of a situation has been resolved, and the only remaining resource is language, which was the appeal to the understanding of how things worked. The offer to explain the reality of the county and its relationships to 2 women who he had by this point accepted were not what he had believed they were, but who he perhaps thought might still be persuaded by the same argument that had persuaded everyone else in Calhoun County for 19 years, which was simply that the machine was large and old and well-connected, and that the cost of opposing it was high. Celine stood in front of him and listened to the pitch until it was complete, and then she said the sentence she had been building toward since the moment he cracked his knuckles at Darnell's bar 11 years, and you could not imagine that someone was keeping count. She said it in the tone of someone closing a file, and then she said nothing else, and Pruitt looked up at her from the floor of the warehouse with the handcuffs on his wrists, and the truth she had just stated sitting in the air between them and what was on his face was not quite fear, and not quite anger, but the specific and devastating expression of a man who has understood, perhaps for the first time in 19 years, that the story he told himself about who he was and what he did was not the story that the record contained. 2 vehicles came down the unpaved access road at 622. The first, a dark, unmarked SUV with no visible markings until the doors opened and the agents emerged with their credentials visible, and the second a civilian car that had been following the SUV since the turn off the county road. And from the civilian car came Cassandra Okafor, who had been working on this story for 14 months, and was not about to be 3 miles away when the chapter that justified all of it occurred. The arrest of Pruitt and Lennox was formal and precise, and documented at every step. Miranda rights read clearly and completely. The handcuffs applied properly, and at the correct tension the process designed from the beginning to be airtight, and the two of them were placed in the SUV, and the doors closed, and the vehicle held its position until the secondary teams at the station and Stills residents confirmed they were ready to move. The search of the police station began at 6:44 in the morning, when 3 DOJ agents and 2 State Bureau officers presented federal warrants to the night desk sergeant, who looked at the documents and looked at the agents and made the calculation that the practical response to a federal warrant is not to interrogate it, but to step aside and stepped aside. The building was processed with the methodical efficiency of people who had done this kind of work before, and who understood that in a case of this size and this duration, the evidentiary record needed to be complete and unimpeachable, and agents moved through Pruitt's locker and desk and evidence records and case files, while administrative staff arrived for the morning shift and found their building occupied in a way that it had not been occupied before. And the reactions distributed themselves along the predictable spectrum from pale shock to visible relief, and the visible relief was the more informative of the two. Warren Stills arrived at his office at 7, which was his consistent pattern, the man who set the schedule of the building he ran, and who arrived first to demonstrate the point, and he found 3 DOJ agents waiting in the corridor outside his door, and he looked at them, and at their credentials and at the search warrant. One of them was holding, and he said nothing, which was the response of a man who had been expecting a version of this moment for long enough that he had moved through the denial and bargaining, and arrived at something that looked from the outside like composure but was actually the particular stillness of a man who has no moves left. The walk through his own station in handcuffs was a long walk, because the building was laid out so that the path from his office to the service exit passed through the main floor, where most of his officers spent their working days, and the officers who were there stood with the flat and carefully maintained expressions of people who are experiencing something they will be processing for years, and are choosing not to feel it yet. And 2 of them stepped back slightly as he passed the smallest physical declaration of a distance they were establishing, and none of them met his eyes, which was its own verdict. Leonard Marsh was arrested at his home at 7:15, which was the time at which the FBI internal affairs team that had been building the case against him for 6 months judged they had sufficient additional corroboration from the night's events to move. And he was at the kitchen table when they came to the door in his robe with a cup of coffee, and the image of the cups on the table, and the robe, and the kitchen, and the handcuffs, and the 28-year career ending in an ordinary domestic moment, was the image that Cassandra Okafor described in the lead of her story, in a way that would be reprinted in 14 other publications. Paula Reeves was pulled aside by the lead DOJ agent while the station processing was ongoing, and she produced from her personal effects a card with a safety deposit box number at the First National Bank of Calhoun County, and she described the contents of the box, and the lead agent looked at her and said that her cooperation would be noted in the fullest possible terms, and she nodded, and then she went to the evidence room door and looked through the window at the filing cabinets that the federal agents were now opening and cataloging the cabinets that contained 20 years of cases. And what was on her face as she looked was not satisfaction, but the specific and complicated expression of someone who has been waiting for a door to open for a long time and is now standing in front of it and understanding for the first time what is actually inside. Cassandra Okafor's story went live at 9 in the morning, digital first, and within 2 hours it had been picked up by every major regional outlet, and by noon it was national. And what drove the velocity of the sharing was not just the story itself, which was large enough and important enough on its own, but the audio, because the DOJ authorized the release of a 3-minute segment of Simone's recording. specifically the section of Pruitt's break room confession, where he named his victims by name and described his technique with the unguarded pride of a man who believed he was speaking in private. And the quality of the audio was something that no amount of denial could neutralize, because it was not a description of what Dale Pruitt was. It was Dale Pruitt in his own voice describing himself. The community of Calhoun County learned what had happened the way communities learn things that have been kept from them for a long time, which is with the specific disorientation of people realizing that the story they were told about their world was not the story their world contained. And the responses moved through the county in the way that water moves through a terrain. It has been kept from finding the low places first. Mabel Delaney heard Pruitt say her grandson's name on the radio she kept in the kitchen, and she sat down in the kitchen chair very carefully and called her daughter. And she did not say anything on the phone for a moment, and then she said, "You were right, baby. You were always right." And her daughter, who had been fighting for Marcus for 8 years, said, "I know, Mama. I know." Theodore Brown heard the story from his nephew, who called him at his shop before it was even fully open, and Brown was in the middle of unlocking the front gate when the call came, and he sat down on the curb outside his shop with the gate half unlocked and the keys in his hand. And he sat there for a long time, and the people who walked by and saw him sitting there understood without asking that something had broken in a direction that was worth sitting down for. Dana Ferris was driving to the school where she had found a new position in a different county when the story came on the radio, and she pulled her car to the shoulder of the road and put it in park, and sat there with the engine running and the radio on. And she listened to Pruitt's voice describing what he had done to her in the language of pride. And she cried not because she was surprised, not because she had ever believed anything other than what she knew, but because being believed is different from knowing you are right, and she had spent 2 years knowing she was right. And this was the first moment that the world outside her own head had confirmed it. The 3 months between the arrests and the federal trial were 3 months in which the investigation that had been running underground for 9 months emerged into the light and was seen in full for the first time. And what it showed was a network that had been operating with the kind of deeply ingrained precision that develops when an operation has enough time and enough institutional cover to become routine. The kind of thing that is not constructed all at once, but accumulates through years of small decisions, each of which is individually defensible in isolation, and collectively constitutes something that when laid end to end looks exactly like what it was. The federal investigation uncovered 23 falsified arrest reports directly linked to Pruitt, every one of them documented with the specificity that Paula Reeves's 14 months of quiet evidence gathering made possible. 7 planted evidence cases, 4 of which had produced prison sentences that were now under immediate review by the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. A financial trail that connected Pruitt's shakedown proceeds through stills to a local real estate developer. And that represented over 11 years, $340,000 in illegitimate income that had been moving through the county's institutional infrastructure, like water through pipes that nobody had inspected because nobody with the authority to inspect them had any interest in what they might find. Lennox cooperated. And his cooperation was the kind that comes from a man who has done the calculation about what cooperation means for his future versus what the absence of cooperation means. And the calculation had produced its answer quickly and clearly. And what Lennox gave the prosecutors was corroboration for the audio evidence on the recording and detail about the operational structure of the network that filled in the spaces between the documented incidents with the connective tissue that made the whole picture coherent. Marsh entered a plea that had been negotiated over 6 weeks and that produced 8 years in federal custody with cooperation credit applied. And the cooperation he had provided was significant in the architectural sense, because Marsh knew where the additional relationships were the county prosecutor who had reviewed and approved Still's arrangements, the real estate developer, who had been the primary financial beneficiary of 11 years of displaced families and foreclosed properties. And the full scope of the network, as Marsh described it, extended the federal investigation into 3 additional prosecutions that would not be resolved for another year. Simone received the case closure notification for Marcus Delaney's conviction on a Thursday afternoon, a document that said in legal language what it meant in human terms, which was that the charges against him had been vacated on the basis of newly discovered evidence establishing that the evidence used at trial had been fabricated, that he was to be released immediately, and that the state was prepared to acknowledge the error with a written apology and a recommendation for a compensation review. She printed it and folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, and it was still there when she drove 2 hours to attend the federal sentencing hearing, because she wanted to carry it there, and she wanted to see what happened when the law that had been used as a weapon for 19 years was used finally and completely to account for itself. The United States District Court for the Northern District of Alabama occupied a building in Birmingham that communicated its purpose through its materials rather than its scale. The mahogany and the marble, and the federal seal behind the judge's bench. Not grandeur for its own sake, but the physical language of an institution that takes its own permanence seriously. And the room where Dale Pruitt's trial was conducted had the specific acoustic quality of high ceilings and hard surfaces that made every sound carry and every silence feel weighted. And on the morning of the sentencing, the room was full, in a way that showed the county had understood that what was happening here mattered in a way that things that happened in county courtrooms in Calhoun County did not usually matter. Pruitt, at the defense table, was 30 pounds lighter than the man who had walked into Darnell Washington's bar 4 months earlier. And the weight was not all that was gone, because the posture was different too. The forward-leaning physical assertion of a man who occupied space rather than requested it had collapsed into something smaller and more careful. The posture of a man who has understood that the space he occupied was no longer his to assert, and he was wearing a suit that belonged to a different life, and that fit him in the way of a garment purchased for an occasion the buyer no longer expected to attend. Then the prosecution played the audio. The courtroom monitor came to life with the sound of a bar on a Friday night, the scrape of a chair across a floor, the clink of ice in a glass, and then Pruitt's voice. His own voice filling the federal courtroom with the same words he had spoken at a corner table in Darnell's bar 11 weeks earlier. That, in this county, the badge was the law. That there was no higher court than the badge on his belt. And then the break room version, the most naked version, the one spoken in the dark with bourbon and certainty, and the absolute belief that no one was listening. The judge's hands were flat on the bench. The jury was completely still. The gallery had gone the kind of quiet that comes when a room full of people is hearing something they cannot unhear. And then the warehouse version played. The final version. The one he had delivered in an abandoned building to 2 women he had planned to make disappear. The sentence that had been born at a bar table, and had grown through a drunk confession and had arrived here in a federal courtroom with his name on the docket, still in his voice, still carrying all of his certainty, still saying that there was no higher court. Pruitt sat at the defense table and hurt himself. His jaw worked once, then stopped. His hands, which had been flat on the table, curled slightly at the fingers. He stared at the monitor that was playing his own voice, and in that moment, the calculation that had taken him 19 years to build collapsed in on itself like a building that loses its foundation, because the badge was no longer on his belt, and the voice on the monitor was the evidence, and the room full of people listening to that voice included a federal judge and 12 jurors, and the 3 victims he had named by name in the break room at 4 in the morning, and every single one of them was hearing the higher court that he had told 2 women did not exist. He could not look at Simone. He could not look at anyone. The audio continued until the prosecution stopped it, and then the room was still for a long moment before the trial continued. Paula Reeves took the stand and presented the 14 months of documentation with the methodical authority of a woman who had been waiting for this room and this occasion for long enough that she had rehearsed for it without knowing she was rehearsing. And she spoke with the particular credibility of a person who had been inside the institution she was testifying against, and who had made a choice at considerable personal cost to document what she saw rather than participate in what it did, and the jury looked at her the way juries look at witnesses who are telling the truth, which is with the specific attentiveness of people who understand that they are being given something real. Mabel Delaney took the stand and told the story of her grandson's arrest and trial and conviction, and 8 years of imprisonment in the voice of a 67-year-old woman who had been waiting for permission to tell this story in a room where it would be heard by people with the authority to act on it. And she did not raise her voice once, and she did not embellish, and she did not need to, because the plain factual account of what had been done to her family was more devastating in its plainness than any embellishment could have been. And when she was finished, the room was very quiet, and several jurors were not looking at her because they were managing their own reactions with the effort of people who understand that the witness deserves their composure. Simone testified as the case architect, and she walked the jury through 9 months of investigation and 1 night of documentation with the methodical precision of a woman who has assembled a complex structure and knows every piece of it and can explain each one without reference to notes. And the story she told was the story of the night from the inside, the hidden device, and the tactical calculation, and the choice to stay in the cells, and the drunk confession, and the warehouse, and what came after. And what the jury understood by the end of her testimony was that what had looked from the outside like a victimization had been from the inside the closing of a trap that had been 9 months in the making. The Judge Honorable Constance Watkins had been on the federal bench for 16 years and had presided over enough public corruption cases to have developed a particular manner for the moments before sentencing in cases of this kind, which was a silence long enough to be felt by everyone in the room before the words began, a silence that said what the room was about to hear was not procedural but consequential. She named the victims in the order they had appeared in the evidence: Marcus Delaney first, then Theodore Brown, then Dana Ferris, then the others' 12 names total. And for each name she noted not just what had been done to that person, but what had been taken from them, because the financial and procedural accounting of what Pruitt had done was one kind of record, and the human accounting of what it had cost was another, and a sentencing that did not acknowledge both was incomplete. She named Stills, and named the structure he had maintained, and named Marsh, and the federal mechanism he had corrupted. And she said that the scale of the corruption documented in this case was not the work of one man operating alone, but the product of an entrenched arrangement across multiple levels of institutional authority, and that the sentence she was about to impose reflected not only what Dale Pruitt had done, but the position of trust from which he had done it, and the deliberate and practiced nature of his conduct over 19 years. Then she looked at Pruitt directly over her reading glasses, and she said the sentence he had used as his personal philosophy back to him as the frame for its own refutation. He had told 2 women that there was no higher court than his badge, and she wanted him to understand, before she told him what was going to happen to him, that he was currently in the higher court, that it had been here the entire time, and that the badge on his belt was currently in a federal evidence locker in a plastic evidence bag and had been replaced by a case number which was the correct ordering of things. The sentence was 22 years in federal custody, the mandatory minimum for kidnapping federal officers, superseding the sentencing guidelines for the other charges, and establishing the floor from which no motion for early release would be heard. Full forfeiture of his municipal pension and law enforcement benefits, $340,000 in restitution to be distributed through a victim compensation fund established in the county's name. The specific recipients and amounts determined by a federal disbursement officer in consultation with the documented victims, and a permanent prohibition from any position in law enforcement, public office, or government service at any level. She said the dollar figure clearly, $340,000, because in her experience, the specificity of financial consequence was the dimension of a verdict that produced the most complete understanding of the cost of what had been done. And then she said that the sentence was the court's answer to 19 years of a man who believed the badge made him the law, and that the answer the court gave was permanent and unambiguous and binding. The gavel came down. The sound of it in that room was the sound of a thing ending, and in the gallery Mabel Delaney closed her eyes for a moment, and Theodore Brown, sitting 3 seats to her left, let out a long, slow breath that he appeared to have been holding for a very long time. And Dana Ferris pressed her hand flat against her collarbone, the way people do when they are trying to hold something steady inside themselves. And the room around them was doing what rooms do when justice finally arrives after a long absence, which is absorb it slowly and in silence before anyone speaks. Warren Stills received 14 years in federal custody on racketeering and conspiracy charges, and the press was present for his departure from the courthouse, and the photographs they produced were of a man whose performance of composure had finally reached its limit, not because he was visibly breaking, but because the composure itself had the quality of an effort rather than a state. The visible expenditure of a man directing all his remaining resources into the single task of not giving the cameras the image of his dissolution. Leonard Marsh entered a plea that produced 8 years in federal custody, and his 28-year career ended at a kitchen table in a bathrobe, and this detail surfaced in the press and would not leave. Craig Lennox received 3 years with cooperation credit, and when he was released he did not return to Calhoun County, which was a decision that suggested he understood something about what he had been part of, that he had perhaps not fully understood while he was part of it. Paula Reeves declined reinstatement in the Reformed Department and accepted a position with the DOJ's Civil Rights Division as a field investigator, and the encrypted drive she had kept in the safety deposit box became a training case study used in federal corruption investigation courses. Darnell Washington's bar was returned to him after 4 months of serving as a federal evidence site, and the community raised money for the renovation through a fund that collected in 2 weeks more than Darnell had spent on the original build-out 22 years earlier. And the cameras stayed upgraded, and the original footage was copied to 3 separate encrypted drives held in 3 separate locations, and the bar reopened on a Tuesday in February and was full from open to close. Cassandra Okafor's investigation won a journalism award and, more importantly, led directly to the review of 4 wrongful conviction cases in Calhoun County, 3 of which resulted in release, and she wrote about each of those 4 cases in a series that ran over 6 months and that she considered the most important work of her professional life. Marcus Delaney walked out of the federal correctional facility on a Tuesday morning in December, and the morning was cold and clear the way December mornings are in Alabama when the sky has decided to be frank about its intentions, and he walked through the gates in the clothes he had been wearing when he arrived 8 years earlier, which did not fit him the same way they had fit him when he was 19 because he was 27 now, and the 8 years had changed him in ways that went beyond the physical and that he was not yet in a position to fully account for. He had gone in at 19 with a full college scholarship and a letter of acceptance from the engineering program at Auburn University, and a grandmother who had told him since he was old enough to understand the words that education was the thing that nothing and no one could take from you, and the irony of that statement delivered by a woman who could not have predicted the instrument that would be used to take it from him had been something he had lived with for 8 years, without the language to adequately describe it. His grandmother Mabel was waiting outside the gates in her Sunday coat, the long gray wool one she wore for church and for occasions of significance, and she was holding a plastic container of food she had cooked the night before. And when Marcus came through the gates and saw her, she looked exactly the same to him as she had looked for his entire life, which was like the most reliable thing in the world. And he walked to her, and she put her arms around him. And neither of them said anything for a long time, because there was nothing to say that would have been adequate to the moment, and Mabel Delaney had always known when words were necessary, and when they were not. Simone and Celine were parked across from the facility entrance in a rental car because they had driven 2 hours that morning to be there, and they had not told anyone they were coming. And they had not been asked, and they were there because Simone had been carrying the case closure notification in her inside jacket pocket for 3 months, and she wanted to be present in the moment the document became real, rather than just official, which is a distinction that matters. They watched from across the road, not intruding on the reunion, and Celine said nothing, and Simone said nothing, and then Marcus looked over his grandmother's shoulder at the car across the road, and he could not have known who they were or why they were there. But there was something in the quality of their presence, the stillness of 2 women sitting in a car on a cold morning who had clearly been waiting, that was unmistakable as intention. Mabel Delaney looked over at the car and then at her grandson, and she said something to him, and Marcus looked back at the car, and Mabel lifted her hand in a gesture towards Simone and Celine. And what she said to Marcus was 4 words, which were, "Those are the ones." Marcus stood at the gate with his grandmother's arm through his, and he looked at the car for a long moment, and then he nodded. Once the nod of a young man who does not yet have the full vocabulary for what he is trying to say, but who understands that the women in the car across the road are part of the reason he is standing outside rather than inside, and the nod was enough. It was exactly enough. Simone touched the scar on her left palm with her thumb, the old scar from the door in Memphis in 2009. The scar she had carried for 15 years, as the reminder of what staying in a dangerous situation cost, and why it was sometimes worth the cost. And she understood in this moment, watching a 27-year-old man stand in December, light with his grandmother's arm through his and 8 years of his life, on the wrong side of a gate, built on a lie that the cost had been the correct investment, and that the scar was not a warning about what staying cost, but a record of what it was for. They did not get out of the car. The moment belonged to Marcus and his grandmother, not to them. They watched until the 2 of them walked to the car that was waiting to take them home, and then Simone started the rental car and pulled out of the lot, and Celine looked out the window at the flat December sky, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence between them was the particular silence of people who have finished a large thing and are in the space between the end of that thing and whatever comes next. Dale Pruitt has been in federal custody for 8 months, and the knuckles that he cracked before every act of cruelty, left hand, then right. The private ritual that the people who feared him learned to listen for the way you listen for thunder, have not cracked once in 8 months, because there is nothing left to enforce, and no one left to perform the ritual for, and the badge that he told 2 women was the only law that mattered. In Calhoun County sits in a federal evidence locker in a plastic bag with a case number printed on the label, and it will remain there indefinitely, and the men in his housing unit know what he was, because news travels in those buildings, and what he was is a category of person that the people who live in those buildings understand in ways they did not learn from the outside. And Pruitt does not have visitors, and the wall of his cell is the same shade of institutional gray every morning. And the sound of the door engaging at lights out is the same sound every night, and that sound which he has heard more than 200 times since his sentencing, and will hear thousands more times before his release date, is the sound of the higher court that he told 2 women did not exist. In Calhoun County on a Tuesday morning in January, a new officer, 3 months into his assignment, does a welfare check on an elderly resident who called the non-emergency line about a noise complaint, and he knocks at her door and waits. And when she opens it, he introduces himself by his first and last name and asks how she is doing and listens to her answer before he asks about the complaint. And the woman at the door is Mabel Delaney, who looks at him with the evaluating attention of a woman who has been forming judgments about police officers for 67 years, and whose judgments have been earned at a price that would have broken someone with less backbone. And when he leaves, she offers him a glass of water, and he says thank you and accepts it. And this exchange, the name introduction, and the listening, and the thank you. And the glass of water is not a dramatic thing. It is not a headline. It is simply what it is supposed to look like. And it looks like this now in Calhoun County, because the distance between what it looked like before and what it looks like now was crossed by people who paid for the crossing with things they did not get back. Simone and Selene Carter do not hold press conferences and do not go on television and do not give speeches. And the week after Marcus Delaney walks out of the facility in December, they are in a different city, at a table in a bar. They have never been in before in summer dresses, because summer dresses are what they wore that night, and summer dresses are what they will keep wearing with a new case file open on the table. Between them and a new set of names highlighted in yellow and 9 months of groundwork already behind them. And the next threshold somewhere ahead, and Simone touches the scar on her left palm and looks at her sister across the table. And Selene raises her glass and they drink to their father, and the work continues. If this story moved you the way it moved us, please take a moment right now to like this video and share it with someone you love, because stories like this one deserve to travel as far as they can, and the people who need to hear them are out there waiting. Subscribe to our channel if you have not already, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss what we put out next, because we will keep telling these stories for as long as they need to be told, and the next one is already waiting for you.